Thank you, everyone, for joining Macro Mondays. Today, we are going to talk about probably one of the more in the weeds things that most people aren't talking about in terms of the Fed and what their problems they're facing. The big thing is, and I've got an article from Claudia Sam, who I recommended following, and I'm going to talk about Claudia here in a minute. But one of my favorite economists that used to work for the Fed is doing an incredible job communicating, some of the problems that the Fed is facing, and also has like the thinking from the Fed because she has worked for them as an economist. So the first thing we want to talk about are supply shocks. I'd like you to recall 2008 and compared to now, and we're going to talk a little bit about, this time is definitely different. And again, a lot of people don't like that statement. This time is different, really. And usually it's in the context of being ironic, but in this case, it is literally the actual truth about how different these recessions are going to be. And again, I think we can argue we're already there, teetering on one, if not in one, versus 08. 08 was a more classic, demand-driven shock. It was definitely because of the housing bubble and things busted there. We had layoffs and therefore supply. Aggregate demand collapsed. So therefore, it was much more a demand-driven recession. There's an argument to be had, and I think there's a solid one, that this is a supply-side shock on this type of recession, and then this is why it's tough. So basically, let's talk about what supply-side shocks are. Essentially, a supply-side shock is events or changes that affect production and supply of goods in inventory. These shocks have impacts in growth, inflation, and employment levels. So some examples that are cited here are natural disasters. For example, think of a local area, floods, stuff like that. Technological advancements can be a supply side shock and can change things there. Changes in government policies, of course, can be a supply side shock. Changes in input costs, like raw materials in the inventory or the supply or limitations there. And then, of course, finally, the big one that I think is really applicable here, global events such as wars, political instability, and pandemics. So we have actually check wars and check arguably political instability in the same context with Ukraine and pandemics. So I think we can argue that this one's definitely a supply side argument. So let me introduce Claudia Sam. I really encourage everyone to follow her on Substack, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Claudia is an excellent communicator about economics issues. You may or may not agree with her, but I think you have to respect where she's coming from personally. And again, just can't recommend following her. Really just an incredible person to follow. So just to talk about her piece that I'm citing here, this was her Substack, which the link is included here. And I will include the link in the notes. So basically, she took a stab at it and said, look, guys, part of the problem the Fed is having is their tools they're better on the demand side. So demand side shock, the tools are much more effective, where on the supply side, they're just not, they're getting at it, but it kind of tangentially and not directly on the point. And that's why part of the problem that they're having and why it's taking maybe longer than anybody wants is because they are not supply side tools that they have. And so, for example, from Claudia's article, the interest rate tools are best cited for demand driven. And she cites that COVID and the war in Ukraine caused the problems in terms of like gas, for example. And think about the supply chain problems from China, for example. That's part of the big problem that we had. And then household finances are good, and interest rates are affecting demand less. It's not really moving the needle too much. And one of the big problems is the labor shortages. We just have too few workers in the labor market, and so essentially, and this is when I referred to, this might cause a little bit of controversy and might upset some people. There's a lot of politicalization around immigration. What, to some extent, there's rightfully so. There should be legal immigration reform, I would argue, but not restriction. I think it should be expanded to handle this, and we can have that discussion. This is a great slide. I'm going to let you guys work through this one on your own. This is just a great slide to show how the federal funds changes will affect demand-driven decisions. And so I'll make sure the slides are in the notes and you can review this. I don't think it would serve anyone to have me actually read it for you. But this is a great slide from the presentation. This is another point that she makes, is that the financial markets just basically are like yawning at the Fed. They're like, yeah, whatever, because they know, hey, we're kind of doing our own thing over here, and they don't necessarily agree with what the Fed's doing, essentially. And then in the long run, you can see that in the long run curve, that they just they're not really too concerned with what's going on. And then the next one is definitely they are having an effect on the interest rate side. That's, of course, that function is still in effect. So this slide here is reflective of that. This is talking about housing units and total starts. We can see here that it did plummet big time because of the interest rates. And for folks that have any interest in the real estate market, we've seen some incredible heat before the interest rate hikes in the especially single family housing sector was really, really hot. And again, here's another great slide she presented, that consumer spending is still moving along, despite the hikes, really just not being phased too much. So the aggregate demand side of this is just not being too receptive to Fed changes. And so that's part of the stubbornness of the inflation problem. And then this is the final slide that really probably is the most controversial, I would say, of her argument, but the one I tend to agree with. And why you may be triggered, because unfortunately, I feel like it's been far too politicized and we haven't dealt with the growth issue. And my argument is that we do not want to repeat the issues of Japan. Japan has had a very xenophobic, I guess is the word I would use, immigration policy. They've been far too reluctant to open up immigration, and as a result, growth suffers. And so we need to think in terms of growth. If we think in terms of growth, we will have smart policies that are, there should be legal immigration. No one argues for an open border. I don't agree with an open border either. Having said that, there should be really great guest worker programs. We can do things that will help America. And again, we're only hurting ourselves by being so negative about immigration. So I urge everyone who's had really strong opinions on this to think real quickly about the long-term implications by shutting down and closing down shop. Where, and again, this is just me. I admit I'm very pro-immigration from the history of America. Everyone here is most likely an immigrant, right? And immigration has been a great thing for America and a great thing for literally the world economy, especially in the United States. So I really am a big believer in immigration reform. And again, I don't think any rational discussion around open borders exists. That's a political talking point, not what anybody really needs or wants. And if they do, I disagree with them. But we should have a legal immigration reform. And this is my last point, and hopefully I didn't alienate too many friends from this, but for sure happy to share ideas about this. But I think this is the bottom line point of something we can do to be proactive to help ourselves moving forward. Demographics is destiny. I hate it. Nobody likes that statement, but I have to finally admit that that's probably true. So as a closing argument, remember demographics is destiny, and think about that. If you want your retirement funds to have a good outcome, think